Hello, hi. So, welcome back to another episode of You Missed a Part, my series where I tell the story of horrific things that have happened to Black people in history. History can be yesterday, history can be hundreds of years ago. It runs the gamut because there's so many different things when you're telling the story of just the history of the world, definitely the history of America. The Black experience is often either sanitized to the point of non-existence or completely erased. And so there's so many of these stories that are out there. I just want to do my part to educate you about those stories. And so the story that I'm telling in this episode is the 1919 Chicago Race Massacre. Now, we're in a really good time right now, pop culturally, to have this conversation, and also what inspired me to want to tell this story, because of shows like Watchmen, Lovecraft Country, which are both really popular shows that center Black characters, and those Black characters have a direct connection to Tulsa and the Tulsa Race Massacre. It's also known as Black Wall Street, and kind of essentially the community, white people in that community banded together in a very organized fashion to burn it down, literally. So they murdered and killed a large majority of they murdered and killed a lot of the residents who lived there. The ones who were not killed they lost everything because they burned the town to the ground. And so, there's a lot of conversations about Tulsa where, I see how these people are like, oh my God, I didn't know this was a thing. And I want it to be made clear that this was not an isolated solo situation where these particular white people were just like, no, and decided to burn down the nearby Black city. This is not an isolated situation. This was a very unfortunately common occurrence. So it wasn't like it happened, every month or every year, but there was a time where these were happening very regularly. And so another reason why I wanted to talk about this is because I see there's sometimes conversations that you'll see happening on social media where people will say things like, well, what if Black people just, we put our heads together and worked cooperatively and put our money together and worked and built our own businesses and just have our own communities and create this kind of, insulated environment where we don't necessarily have to deal with the structures and the systems of white supremacy. And those ideas are fantastic. They've happened before. And when that happened, white people burned it down, period. That's what happened. And burned it down in mass, where people were killed, family lines were either ended or severely hampered. Family fortune, like imagine if your family lived in Tulsa in 1920, 1917, and had a home and had a business, and kind of was building that generational wealth, and then the white people burn all of it down. So now you go from being, middle class, upper middle class to lower class, and possibly even homeless, just depending on what other resources you might have access to. And again, Black people didn't just have access to the same resources that white people did because of racism and Jim Crow and all of that. So there's these conversations that are happening where people are like, all we have to do is this. And it's like, yeah, that's done before. This isn't just about Black people not working together. This is about white people as a generalized collective. So yes, I'm going to say this once. I'm not going to continue to say it. I'm going to say this once now at the beginning. I'm not talking about all white people. But when I say white people, it's a large enough group where I can just say white people. I don't have to say the Johnsons, because I'm not just talking about white people in one city. These race massacres happen in multiple cities and multiple years. There was a summer called the Red Summer, which is the Chicago Race Massacre happened during the Red Summer, where white people were burning down Black communities across multiple cities in the United States. So this wasn't just an isolated thing. So I'm just going to say that because that's kind of that's where we are. That's where we're starting with this baseline. But, it's not that simple. When Black people have been able to accumulate or begin to accumulate wealth or begin to have this level of, financial generational wealth, it was taken away very violently, and there was no, like, no one was sued or no one had to pay a fine. None of that happened. Those families just lost everything. And so I think it's important to tell these stories, especially about these race massacres, because we are still dealing with white supremacy, and white supremacy has definitely been used to beat down the Black community, Black American community, for sure. And so the Chicago Race Massacre is another one of those stories. So, also I wanted to mention, because you have all this conversation about the Tulsa Race Massacre because of the Watchmen in Lovecraft Country, but there was also a movie in '97 that came out, and it was about the Rosewood Massacre in 1923 that was in Florida. And it was a movie that told that story. And I actually remember going to see that movie. I saw it in the theaters, and it was like, I was in a Black neighborhood, so it was like a lot of Black people who went to the theater to see it. And when I tell you, the anger was palpable. The anger was palpable as we walked out of that movie, because that was, for me, my first time learning about race massacres and the fact that they happened. And so in '97, I was in high school. I just told my age. I don't care. I was in high school in '97, or not high school. I was in college. I was a freshman in college in '97, and it was eye-opening and upsetting and demoralizing. Like, it was so many things. And so that for me was my entryway. And I learned about Tulsa, I think a little bit after that as well. But I think that, like I said, that was in Rosewood in 1923. That wasn't too far. That was a couple of years after Tulsa, a few years after Chicago. Like, these things happened in everywhere from these smaller towns like a Rosewood to large metropolitan areas like Chicago. They were not just, because there's also this misconception that, like, the racism was most virulent in the South and the Deep South. So once you got to like the industrial areas, the cities, people were more civilized and they were not as virulently racist. Not true as well. And so that's also what I want to highlight telling the story. Last reason why I was inspired to tell the story is because I am originally from Chicago. I was born in Chicago and lived there until I was about 7 before I moved to Atlanta, which is why I don't have a largely Southern accent. Nor do I have a largely Midwestern accent. I think the two kind of neutralize themselves for me. So I landed here. But it's my home city. I wanted to do race massacres in either, I was saddened to see that I live in cities where there have been race massacres in both Chicago and in Atlanta. And I definitely plan to do the story of the Atlanta Race Massacre as well, because I think it's important to tell too. But I wanted to start with this one. And so this is the one we're starting with. Now, like I said, kind of before when I was prepping this and giving that backstory, Red Summer was a period of several months in 1919 when there were multiple race massacres in different cities across the country. The one, and when I was doing my research, I saw an article that said that the one in Chicago was one of the worst or one of the biggest ones. And it probably was because Chicago's a major metropolitan city and there was a lot more people just in the mix because it's a larger city. So I wanted to make sure to talk about that because I think that's interesting. So a little bit of backstory before we get into these race massacres. And the backstory kind of provides some cultural context. Slavery was abolished in 1865. And if you don't know, you should definitely I would encourage you to do some research into kind of what it looked like once slavery was abolished. It wasn't just like all of a sudden the gates were open and Black people were free and then just kind of able to go out and flourish and be their best selves. White people, especially in communities where slavery where there was a lot of slaves. So another interesting point that I didn't even think about until I kind of started paying attention to conversations about this was that, like, there were a lot of slaves in certain areas, and sometimes there were more enslaved people, more enslaved individual than there were white people or not enslaved people. And so when slavery was abolished, you had a lot of these freed black people who were, and there was like more of them than than white people in certain areas. And so what would happen, those people, the black people would, they got out of slavery, but a lot of them, not a lot, some of them would have like skills that they developed or that they had while they were enslaved. They were able to use those to, get jobs and kind of start businesses, try to make a way, because you have to now it's time for you to make a way for yourself in this land that you were forcibly brought to, but now you're here. And most of the people who, once slavery was abolished, slavery had been going on for a few generations, so those people were American in spite of the circumstances. And so it's not like they're gonna hop on a plane, not a plane. I'm not a plane, but I'm saying they're not gonna hop on the next boat back to the next ship going back to the continent, because where are they gonna go? They don't know where they're from. They have been in America for multiple generations. What they know is that they're from North Carolina, or they're from Georgia, or they're from, they're not from the continent, because they don't have a connection to that. So again, how horrible, the whole chattel slavery system was for the enslaved black people, enslaved Africans, my ancestors who experienced that. You basically are made free in this land that obviously does not see you as a whole person, but now you have no ancestry, you have no direct connection to the place where your ancestors, maybe your great-great-grandmother, great-great-grandfather, or great-great-great, depending, or even great, depending on when, you might have been kidnapped and brought over in the Middle Passage. And so, because there were still trades happening around that time, like they had definitely diminished considerably, but it does mean that had stopped. There were still people from the African continent being kidnapped, enslaved, and brought to various parts of the Americas. And so, those people were like, well, I'm here, I need to just make a life. And so they started to do that. And some of them started to run for office, and they were voting because they were no longer enslaved. They were now considered at least people to a degree. And so, you have this happening, and the white people in these areas are like, oh man, like we have to figure out a way to quench this, these black people becoming prosperous, because they're thinking that the black people are just going to decide to rise up and kill them all, maybe, possibly. I know that would explain that would explain some of the reasoning why certain things happen, aside from just racism and just kind of thinking how dare, these black people try to be successful, but just kind of, what if you're thinking that they think like you, okay, now we got to get rid of them because they might try to get rid of us. And so then you have this happening, which obviously that wasn't happening in mass. For the most part, black people were just like, all right, now we're not enslaved, now we need to work and we need to take care of our families and we need to build a life for our generation, for our people here, because this is where we are now. And so this would happen. And because Jim Crow was basically immediately kind of began to be implemented by violent means, because you had the KKK and other kind of groups, militias of white people going out and terrorizing black people. And so in certain areas where there was a larger population of black people, or they were just they had been there in mass, and largely the South, because the large percent, 3/4 or so of the enslaved black people who were in the United States were in the South. There were definitely some in other cities. And so there was a great migration that started around 1914, 1916, where a lot of Black people migrated from the South to northern cities. And so they did that to escape the racism, the more virulent kind of aggressive racism. But they also did it because there was an industrial labor boom, because World War I happened, and a lot of the European immigrant population that was kind of coming from Europe and settling in the United States and kind of, doing that industrial labor, though that kind of stream of people stopped because World War I happened. I'm sure that affected travel, but also it was World War I, so people aren't necessarily like trying to rock with the different areas. They're just, that affected it, which means that meant that there was a shortage of labor. And so Black people in the South were like, word, let's go up there, let's get some jobs, let's, improve our station in life, because again, that is what all of us are trying to do. We're trying to have a good life, take care of our family, improve things the way we would like to, or keep them status quo, but whatever it is, we're doing the work for that. And so that is what was called the Great Migration. I definitely have done a little bit of research into my family background and have found relatives from like Mississippi, relatives from, I guess, kind of the Plains area, Arkansas, where they kind of came over to Chicago, which, industrial. So that's what was happening. It was a migration. And of course, though, you had these European immigrant populations, Italian, Polish, like the different, they were also in Chicago. And it's definitely very evident when you go to the city, you can see these different kind of, different cultural imprints. So of course you have the Black side of town, you have the Irish, or you have the Polish, you have the Italian, like that was, and so that was during that time, that was when that kind of began to be cemented. And so that population was very much not really pleased with all of the Black people coming to town, and were on top of being racist, also just kind of saw it as these Black people were coming to take our jobs, even though there was a shortage of labor. So the jobs weren't being taken from them; they existed, and the Black people came and filled that vacuum of that was a need. But of course, that we're already in this time of racism, and it's just a tense time, just in the country culturally, and so you have these populations of people that are kind of around in each other's spaces in a way that they maybe had not had been before, and that just made things a powder keg. And so this is the environment where the like Red Summer happened, and like these, because a lot of these race riots, this is the environment. And so, as with the Tulsa Race Massacre, it was kind of the impetus to the race massacre was a crime. Or not, it actually wasn't necessarily a crime. It was a perceived crime in Tulsa, where it was with the boy in the elevator, and the girl said that he had assaulted her, which I don't know if that was like found out to be false. I don't know that. I'll do a little bit of research and see if I can find an article. If that was, I don't think I have read or seen where the story about what happened, if that turned out to not be true, or if that turned out to be maybe blown out of proportion or whatever, I don't know. But nonetheless, that was where we are at the time. In Chicago, the race massacre the impetus for that was actually the murder of a Black boy named Eugene Williams, which really kind of tugged at my heartstrings, because my grandfather, uncle, and cousin on my mom's side, and my uncle on my dad's side are named Eugene. That is a very old Black man name. And so, just the fact that his name is Eugene Williams, that just really kind of like got me. But Eugene was swimming at Lake Michigan, and somehow white people had decided that they could divide the lake into Black and white side. I'm like, how do you divide a lake? But racism empowers people. And so Eugene was out swimming with his friends, and he floated into the white portion of Lake Michigan. And before he could try to get out of it, either one white boy or a group of white boys began to throw stones and rocks at him. And so they basically threw the stones and rocks at him and caused him to drown. So of course the black people are like, what is this? And so they, call the police, because, police are supposed to protect the citizens, and black people were citizens. And so they called the police. The police came and determined, so I'm going to read this, I'm going to read this verbatim because I thought this was bananas, if I could find it verbatim. But the police came and they were, of course, they were like, well, we're not going to arrest the man or boy who, basically stoned this black boy to death where he drowned, because I'm going to paraphrase, but they said because police determined that the boy drowned because the rocks made it so that he could not resurface when he fell off his raft. Because these are apparently magical rocks, like the one in the movie Labyrinth. So, not unlike the protests that happened here, in Atlanta, in Minnesota, in so many cities where just over the summer in recent years where there's been big mass protests because of the killing of an unarmed black person. And not unlike that, where basically this black boy was murdered and the police were like, the rock stopped him from coming up to the surface, so he drowned. And so of course the black people are enraged, they are pissed, they're angry, they're mad. They just watched this boy be killed by these either other boys or man. Either way, they just watched this boy be killed, and so they're demanding justice. Of course, that adds to the already tense time, and then violence breaks out on the South Side, which, as we know today, the South Side of Chicago is where a lot of the black people live. My family, when I lived in Chicago, I lived on the South Side. My mom's side of the family largely lives on the South Side. My dad's on the West Side, which is another part of Chicago that is where the black people live. And of course, black people live all over the city, but the large concentration of black people, but also that's when the lower income, some of the lower income areas are on those parts of town as well as nicer areas. But you know what I'm saying. It's the black part of town. And so that is where violence broke out. And in that time, it was the neighborhoods that were surrounding the stockyards, which were where a lot of black people lived, because of course a lot of black people moved to the area to work, but also a lot of European immigrants. And so it all kind of started in their backyards. And, the police, according to these articles that I'm reading with the side eye, the police were unable to quell the violence, and now the state militia was called in, and of course people continue to fight, is what they're saying. Well, not of course. So the police were unable to do anything. The state militia was called in, and at the end of it, and then shootings began, and then there was arson attacks, and at the end of it, there were 38 people were killed, 15 white people and 23 black people. Now, just think how similar this sounds. The police come, and so July 27th was when Eugene Williams was murdered at Lake Michigan. And that was the day that was kind of the powder that kind of was the match that kind of lit the flames of the violence. And so this is happening, and the fighting and everything started on the 27th, continued until August 3rd. So a good week or so, about a week, that this is happening largely on the South Side, but I'm sure it's spilled into other parts of Chicago. And, the police couldn't do anything, so they had to call in the state militia. Sounds familiar? And then, fightings and beatings and arson attacks and things of that nature took place, and that many people were killed. The thing about, 38 people died. That's substantial, and I plan on doing my own kind of ancestry research into the area, because I would be interested to see where my family kind of fell in with what was happening here. Because I mean, 1919, my grandfather was born in 1920, I think 1930. I would be lying because I cannot remember what year he was born. But I mean, like that time would be my grandparent time. So if not then, maybe like within 10 years after. Not a huge. It's not like my great great grandparent or great great great. It's just grand, possibly great. Like that's 1, 2. Like that's not that far from me. It's not that far removed because my parents and then my grand. That's 2 and then 3. 2 or 3 generations from me. It's not that far. And so I want to keep saying that because I think people are always like, well, why are you like, this is so long ago. I'm sure my grandfather can tell me something about Red Summer. I'm sure he could. It may not be from his own direct experience, but it could be from what his father or uncle or, friend older or whatever might have told him. Like, this is not that far. And so this happened. And so again, 38 people died. That's too many people to die from this kind of stuff, just in general at one time. But the thing where it was most devastating is that more than like 500 people were injured. About 60% were Black. So you have all these people that are injured. And then an additional 1,000 Black families were left homeless after rioters torched their residences. So those 1,000 Black families who had homes, who had jobs, who were beginning to build some generational wealth and kind of begin to create a foundation for their families, now have to start from zero. And who knows how many of those Black families, they might have lost their jobs because they didn't have a home. They might have had to move and flee because where they live is no longer safe. Like, so many things. And so it's just disheartening to think about that, but it's even more disheartening to think about how close that was. Like I said, my grandfather, I can't remember if he was born in the 20s or the 30s, but like, I'm just saying that. And that's my grandfather, not my great grandfather or my great great grandfather, my grandfather. So that means that my great grand family were alive and moving around there. And I am from Chicago. I have on my father's side, we go really far back into Chicago history. We're not just like we moved up there in the 70s. Like, my family has been there for some years. And so my family that lived on the South Side, I lived on the South Side. I could have had family members that were affected by that directly, which means that, they could have been one of the 1,000 people left homeless. So now the generational wealth that I could have right now, I could possibly not have because of a race massacre in Chicago. Like, the gravity of that, the enormity of that is beyond comprehension for me in moments, especially like this, because I've never said it like that before. Like, that's crazy. And so I want to tell these stories because I think they need to be known, because we need to know our history, but also to show how close there was, how close these things were to us, to people living today. I'm not old. I mean, somebody who's 12 might beg to differ. It's fine. But I'm not old. I'm not in my 60s. I'm not even in my 50s. I'm not even close to 50. Like, I am early 40s. Like, I'm not old. I'm a Gen Xer. And actually, if you look at, I'm like a Zennial. I'm like a couple of years older than millennials. Like, y'all, this is, it astounds me when I think about this. And so I'm going to stop now because I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments about this story, but also about some other ones. So if you know of a tale, whether you know it to be true or you think it to be true, share it with me. Send it to the email that I'm sharing here, so that I would love to be able to research more of these and learn more and be able to share more stories of Black history, because when you look at the history books right now, they definitely miss a part. Thank you for tuning in. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe so that you can be, and turn on your notifications for my channel so that you can be notified when I upload my next video. So it was great talking with you in spite of the heavy subject. I look forward to reading your comments, and I look forward to the next time that we can talk again. Bye.